There's increasing pressure across the entire economy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The impetus on reducing emissions from farm to fork in the food system will also increase. It's important that we not only understand where emissions are created and how many emissions there are and what efforts we might do to mitigate them, but also to understand the economic incentives that might help us decrease or might cause increases in greenhouse gas emissions. My name is Mike Von Massow, and this is the Food Focus podcast. My guest this episode is Dr. Alfons Weersink, a professor in the Department of Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics at the University of Guelph. We talk about some of the economics around emissions associated with crop production and why sometimes those create tensions with reductions, and also how there's a real potential to reduce emissions through policy, and that policy doesn't necessarily need to be a stick, but there can be carrots, there can be education, and these things can help us achieve some of the emissions targets that we need to achieve. Before we get to the conversation with Alphonse, I thought I would just say again, thanks for listening. Our audience continues to grow, and I appreciate the messages of support and interest. You can find the podcast anywhere you look for a podcast. If you enjoy it, leave us a positive review. That allows others to find us as well. And we appreciate your support as our audience continues to grow. Now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Alphonse. Well, hello, Alphonse. Thanks for taking the time today. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Hello, Mike. Good seeing you.
So Alphonse, we're hearing a lot of conversation about reducing emissions in agriculture. We're hearing people on both sides of the argument. We need to do better. We're hearing people say, well, we can't do it and not compromise on things like yields or production. Let's start at what are some of the things we can do, perhaps, to reduce the emissions associated with crop production?
So if we're talking crop production, the main thing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions will be fertilizer management and how much you put on, when you put it on, and in the form. It's referred to as the 4 Rs, Mike, and that is the fertilizer management strategy that will guide farmers in reducing their amount that they use, but probably more importantly, their greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, so I, as you know, I had a conversation earlier with Claudia Wagner Riddle, sorry, and she talked sort of specifically about some of the science behind those things. What I think I'd like to get from your perspective is we're hearing people say, Fertilizer Canada and others say that if we change the way we use fertilizer, we'll see dramatic reductions in yields, and there are trade implications, there are food security implications, and all those sorts of things. Can we do some of these, and those might be worthwhile in the face of emissions, but can we do things to reduce the emissions associated with fertilizer without significantly compromising crop production?
Yeah. So in case of the situation with those 4 Rs, Mike, the main one, in order to have any really significant impact on greenhouse gas emissions, would be reducing the rate. Timing. So going to split application is a means, and inhibitors as well will slow the release, but they're not big players. Ultimately, you got to reduce the rate. And it's complicated in terms of whether the yield impacts. The response function to fertilizer tends to be, or the payoff to fertilizer tends to be very flat around the optimum. So, for example, if the optimum is 250 kilograms per hectare, there can be like only a $10 per hectare difference if you use 30 kilograms less or 30 or a range of 30 kilograms. So 15 kilograms less or 15 kilograms more. So quite a range. You don't have to be very precise then. And that's one implication. And also, it does suggest that, well, maybe we can reduce fertilizer levels without having too much of an impact on yield. But it's complicated beyond that. So, you start with there and saying, uh, wow, you've got this flat payoff function. Why don't farmers reduce their yields? Reduce their N rate because it's not going to affect their yields very much. But there are a host of factors, and that sort of complicates the design of policy to try to achieve that objective.
So let's stick with I'd like to get to policy in a second, but let's stick with that first thing. So you're saying that the marginal benefit of the additional 30 kilos of the expected marginal benefit is relatively low. Then why are we doing that then?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of reasons that farmers do it. One is that they're getting advice from people who have the incentive to sell.
Yeah.
So that's one. But I also think there are a number of other reasons. One is that farmers hate to look at a poor looking crop. There's an intrinsic value that they get from having a green, healthy looking crop. And you want to ensure that you've got enough fertilizer to make sure that happens. You don't want to have, under apply and then the weather's good and then your crop just looks like it's lagging behind. So there's that. There is an insurance aspect to it. We did some work looking at the pay. Why do farmers tend to over apply? So they actually apply more than the optimal rate rather than cut down. And it's this insurance aspect that they that the benefit that they get from over applying year after year is paid off when the weather is really good. Okay, get the rains at the right time, you get sufficient temperature, you get a real yield boost if you've got the right amount of fertilizer on or enough fertilizer on. And that outweighs the costs of over applying in the other years when you don't get that yield boost. The other is something referred to as prospect theory, Mike, where that farmers value a loss more than a gain. Okay, so a yield reduction of 10 bushels an acre hurts a lot more than a yield gain of $10 per hectare. So they want to avoid that loss as well. And so there's a series of these things that I think prevent farmers from reducing that rate, even though there might be environmental benefits from doing so.
So let me just make sure I understood what you said. The first thing you said was, even though it's very flat at the optimal rate, we see some farmers actually over applying to reduce the risk of a crop loss. And that's both from a prospect theory and from a risk management. Let's get those big years when we can get them.
Yeah,
and realize that in other years we might over apply, but
yeah,
the cost is covered by the gain in those good years.
exactly.
And am I correct to say in years that we over apply, the risk of emissions is higher because that fertilizer isn't getting used?
Exactly. Yeah, that's
So
the downside.
yeah,
Whatever isn't taken up often is going either down into the ground
yeah.
through nitrates, or it's going up into the air as nitrous oxide.
So environmental costs either way, either as a greenhouse gas or leaching into the
Yeah.
water table.
Hmm.
So are the uh, so prospect theory makes us sometimes make decisions uh, that aren't necessarily economically optimal because
Right.
we react more to the loss than we do to the gain.
Yeah.
Um, have you done work that looks at whether the uh, whether the purely the economics of over applying pay, or is that just a perceived benefit?
No, we did that a while ago with former student Predrag Rajic, who's now at the University of Waterloo, and that's the idea that the expected returns, no risk averse behavior, nothing like that. It's just expected returns over a period of time from those boosts in yields. In those good years, outweighs the cost of over applying in the average and not so good years. So yeah, that's
So even if we were being completely rational, if we were not considering the environmental costs of over application, that there is a clear economic incentive to over apply.
yeah, along with all these other behavioral aspects. And I think the value of a good looking crop, that intrinsic value to producers, is really important. And so that's yet another a major driver from preventing them from reducing that rate from 250, for example, that we
Yeah.
suggested as an optimal.
So before listeners roll their eyes and say, "Oh, the vanity of farmers that the crop has to look good when the neighbors drive by," that's a phenomenon that's not unlike people with pristine lawns and gardens in suburbia, or a fancy car in the driveway. It is this isn't a characteristic that's unique to farmers by any stretch.
No, no. Yet, the it also means, though, that I think, unlike a good-looking lawn, is that a good-looking crop is going to pay off. When they say green crops, it means green
Yeah.
dollars as well. So there is that vanity aspect, I guess you can say. That yeah, I'm doing a good job,
Yeah,
okay, and
but
that
I
good
was going
job
to
is
ask
going
that
to.
exact I was going to ask that exact question it isn't just about vanity. It is when a crop looks good, it performs well, right?
That's right,
It grows
exactly.
better, it yields better. If a
Yeah,
crop looks stressed, just like you and I, if we are stressed, we're not as productive as when we're not. And
that's right.
it isn't just vanity. It is a bit different than having the best looking lawn in the neighborhood.
That's right. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So in this circumstance, then we have we have a bit of an issue where we have a clear environmental cost, and there'll be people who disagree with how big that cost is and how important that cost is, but the cost clearly exists, and we have an economic signal that says apply more and apply lots. And you did talk earlier about the ability to sort of split
Yes.
applications, and
Hmm.
precision agriculture will probably allow us to vary rates on different, depending on the needs, and all of those will help us deal with, to a degree, that over application. But we still have the economic incentive to over apply. How can policymakers sort of look at finding ways to incentivize farmers not to over apply, so that we mitigate some of these environmental, whether it's through greenhouse gases or through
Hmm.
nitrification of waterways?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a difficult one. One of the ways is that maybe you create an incentive, a financial incentive, and that could be through a stick, and maybe you impose a tax on fertilizer use, and by increasing that price, you will reduce the rate. Um, that tends not. Several states in the U.S. have used it. Some jurisdictions in Europe have used it, but it has typically been relatively ineffective, and that's because there are few substitutes for fertilizer. For inorganic fertilizer, I guess you could use organic, you could use probably rotations, but those are longer term things that you could adjust over time to. So, you raise the price of fertilizer, and, fertilizer prices have really shot up over the last 6 months. And so we can see whether it will change the levels that farmers use. Not likely very much, because there's few alternatives to that. So, instead, they almost use it like these jurisdictions that have fertilizer taxes use it almost like a means to generate revenue that is funneled to other programs, almost like a syntax you could think of,
Yeah.
because um, and those revenues are used to fund two types of programs. One would be an educational program, and and this might work particularly in terms of nitrogen because or fertilizer to demonstrate the differences in alternative rates. So, if farmers could be compensated for having a strip where they applied less, okay, to see what is the difference, maybe then they'll go like, wow, that there maybe wasn't that big a difference as I was afraid of. Okay, because they're afraid of changing too. That's
Yeah.
another probably thing. This is where I'm at. It's been working. Why should I change? And and so that's one aspect of the education. The other aspect is informing them about nitrous oxide emissions in particular and how it's associated with. I think farmers have been very good to react to environmental problems where they can see the cause and effect. I applied manure in the wintertime and I see the runoff directly into the creek, and that isn't good. Okay,
Yeah.
so I'm not going to do that. Whenever they see the cause and effect, they're good at changing. It's hard with you can't see nitrous oxide emissions up, and even if you could, the relationship between the amount that an individual farmer applies and where they apply it on the field and weather conditions, it will vary with the amount that goes up. So that would be another aspect. And then just having them be aware of what goes in, what this crop requires, and and match their fertilizer program to those needs. And some do a pretty good job at that, but that's you could probably subsidize, encourage the use of those sorts of programs so that farmers are more aware of crop requirements and matching the requirements based on their soil fertility and soil health and to what is actually required for the by the crop.
So that makes sense. The education program and sort of putting some social pressure on to say, look,
Hmm.
this is a global issue, uh, and everyone needs to do their part. Now, I would argue that we've not seen a lot of success from that. We often hear people say, "Oh, we're a small chart. We shouldn't do it. They're more important, or they're more
Hmm.
important."
Hmm.
Or, we've seen
Hmm.
agriculture say cars are. The truth is, if we're going to reduce emissions, we have to do it in small amounts across the board rather than say, well, that's the big one. That's the one there's
Right,
not going to be a
right,
silver bullet.
right. But I think you can. But I think, Mike, you could. It's cost share programs that have been the typical means of encouraging farmers to adopt. So, in terms of these, generalizing agro-environmental programs, we've used sticks to prevent farmers from going back. Okay, in other words, we don't want you in using a practice that's going to emit more greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so you can't go there. But they use subsidy programs, carrots, to pull to attract farmers to adopt new practices or different practices that have environmental benefits. And so the latest federal budget included $300 million for the subsidization of practices that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, in practices, the encouraging 4Rs, encouraging the use of cover crops, some set aside, some rotational grazing. Those are kind of the main four categories that they've identified where they are going to allocate money as cost share to try to get farmers to adopt these practices.
Okay, so my question is, and maybe we don't know the answer yet. Do those work? Do they provide? Do they develop sustainable change so that when those subsidies or cost sharing are decreased or disappear, do we see a reversion, or do we have we incentivized the change and buffered the uncertainty of the change as they learn, but once they've learned, they stick with it?
Right. Yeah, no, it's a good point, Micah. And, there are lots of examples where, for example, farmers were paid to set aside land through, uh, many countries have used that. And then when crop prices go up, all of a sudden, well, we'll forget that. Or particularly for some practices that are capital intensive and require a large outlay. And then, what happens at the end of the 3 years? Is it worth continuing to do? That money is dried up. Um, and then there's this, and that's one side. And on the other side, there is something referred to as additionality when assessing these programs. That um, if we give you some money, but you know what, you were going to do it anyhow. And so that's
Yeah.
not really an effective use of dollars. So trying to determine those that were going to do it anyhow from those that need that extra boost to get over. So some of it is just making farmers aware and getting that push off from where they currently are. Uh, but yeah, the cost efficiency of them is sometimes pretty debatable.
Yep. So this has been really interesting, Al, and I've got one more question here, and then I'll give you a chance to add anything if I forgot to ask you something. Um, it strikes me that some of those sort of cost share transition programs, just like the set aside program, will depend a little bit on market circumstance. We're
Yeah.
currently in quite high grain prices, if I'm not mistaken, and also high fertilizer prices, which makes the high crop price makes it a little easier to deal with the high fertilizer price.
Hmm.
Um, but but high crop prices increase that economic incentive to make sure we don't leave any potential
Hmm.
yield in the field that might
Hmm.
increase the incentive to
Exactly.
to over apply.
Right.
And if
Yeah.
crop prices are low and fertilizer prices are high still, that decreases the incentive. So there are other issues that come into play here as to when such implementations may or may not work.
Exactly. No, and so you gave the example. What happens when market prices are very high? And the counter is, and I think you've explained what could happen for sure. The counter is when commodity prices really drop, and and then we have support programs like agri-stability that kick in, and there will be those that argue that it continues to support a fairly narrow rotation, and and the crop choices aren't as diverse as they would be if it would be if you let the market decide, or if you modified agri-stability to allow to encourage more diversification.
Well, yeah, now we're going back 30 years to my master's thesis, I think,
Yeah, that's
Alphonse, and
right,
looking at
right?
the
Yeah.
impact of risk programs on
Yeah.
cropping decisions. So uh, there's clear opportunity for us to reduce the emissions from crop production. There's probably an opportunity to do it without having significant economic impacts if we spend time on management and understanding with some of those practices at the margin.
Mhm.
If it's a priority for governments, and we see that it is, we've seen governments come in and already provide some incentives
Yeah.
for changing behaviors. We might see other things. Maybe within agri-stability we have a sustainability bonus or something.
Right.
There's lots of
Yeah.
things we can do, but there are opportunities. Uh, there are opportunities for crop production to contribute to uh, to emissions reductions without decimating necessarily the the crop production and the profitability of farms.
Right. I would agree, Mike. And but I'm just thinking about another thing that another reason for not changing uh, fertilizer management too much is that in crop production, you've got this small window, right? When you have to put the crop in the ground and fertilizer goes on maybe at planting, maybe even before. And it's just like, let's get it on. We got to skitter scatter. Let's get at her. And and that, so it's not as, but you put more focus on the cost of ignoring the environmental aspects of it, then farmers will probably look at at adjust being more careful in their fertilizer management.
Yeah. Good. Well, thanks, Al. That's been excellent, and I learned some stuff, and that's always cool too. Is there anything that you'd like to add, or did we cover what you thought was important here?
Yeah, no, I think the last bit that I added, I should have probably mentioned earlier. And as uh, producers get bigger and bigger, then that aspect of timing and the cost of not getting things in the ground it grows, I think, or the possibility of it grows. So, no, yeah, no, it's an interesting one, and it has definitely generated a lot of interest amongst the farm groups. It's the federal government has identified as the new ag policy framework is being negotiated, that environmental sustainability is a key component, and so they are going to be directing efforts, whether it's sticks or carrots, and farm groups are responding in kind to say how can we part of the solution.
Yeah.
So
And I think that's an important point and a great place to end is that farmers aren't fighting this. Farmers are saying, help us make the
yes,
adaptation, but in many cases they're recognizing the issue and are looking for ways to maintain a profitable business, because that's what it is, while while contributing to greenhouse gas reductions more broadly that are prioritized by us as society. So
that's right.
good. Thanks, Al. That was awesome, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Mike. Good seeing it.
That wraps up another episode of the Food Focus podcast. We very much appreciate you taking the time to listen. If you just discovered Food Focus, you can subscribe anywhere you get podcasts. If you enjoy the podcast, please give us a review. It helps others find us. Before we go, I want to thank my producer, Zach, for his hard work in making each episode sound good and for his original music that helps us transition. He does the hard work, and we get to have all of the fun. Thanks. Have a great day.